Last month, I did an entire episode about cozy podcasts because listening to a cozy podcast is one of my favorite ways to lean into the fall season. If you want to listen to that episode, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It was a good one. It made me so happy. Today's episode is also about cozy podcasts, but kind of a subgenre of cozy podcasts, food podcasts. I'm Andy Smiley, the Friendly Podcast Guide. I'm a mom who has used podcasts to fight the boredom and loneliness of motherhood, and now I want to help you find a podcast that can do the same thing for you. It can be overwhelming to try and find a podcast you'll enjoy in the thousands of shows that are out there. That's where I come in. My episodes are short and they answer all of the questions you'll have about the podcast, so you'll know if it's a good fit for you or not. I'm here to help you find a podcast you'll love without wasting your time. Now, let's talk podcasts. And before I dive into my recommendations for today, I have to give a shout out to the podcast Sporkful. I talked about it last month in the Cozy Podcast episode I mentioned just barely, but I just have to say Sporkful is a delightfully cozy food podcast that I won't dive into today, but if you want to learn more about it, go listen to that episode about cozy podcasts. The first official recommendation in today's episode is the podcast The Food Chain. This food podcast looks at the business, science, and cultural significance of food. It's a BBC podcast, so you get to hear about food from all over the world. The people they interview on the show are usually regular people talking about their experience or their jobs, so their conversations usually feel more approachable and real. Each episode is around 30 minutes long. One episode that I really enjoyed listening to is actually from last year, but I still can't stop thinking about it. It's called What Do Astronauts Eat? It's a fascinating look at this basic human need in a very unique place, space. The next food podcast on the list for today is called Gastropod. It's a podcast that looks at the hidden history and surprising science behind different foods and food-related topics. The episodes are well-researched and not only have the fabulous voices of the two hosts, they also bring in other voices, including experts and enthusiasts. They also take you along for the ride when they go on adventures to labs, donut shops, fields, and archaeological digs. Each episode is about 45 minutes long. Their recent episode about donuts was fascinating and educational and delicious. I highly recommend listening to it. I'll make sure to link it in the show notes. Another great food podcast is called A Taste of the Past. This podcast is hosted by a culinary historian who takes us on a journey through the history of food in an interesting way, from Cuban sandwiches to cookies and everything in between. Each episode, the host has a conversation with a different guest who brings enthusiasm and a different perspective to whatever part of food history that episode is centered around. One recent episode that would be fun to start with is called America's Burgers. I'll make sure to link it in the show notes. Before we talk about more food podcasts, we're going to take a quick break to talk about my free podcast consultations. I've been able to talk to some amazing podcasters about their shows while doing interviews for the Friendly Podcast Guide. And along the way, I've learned so many tips and tricks on how to start a podcast from the hosts I've interviewed and from personal experience. I've talked to podcast hosts about what made their launch successful and what made it more difficult. And I for sure know what I would do differently if I could go back and launch my show again. And I want to share my knowledge with you. That's why I'm offering free podcast consults, and I have a few spots open in the next month. If you need help nailing down your podcast idea, figuring out your niche, or have any other podcast questions, I would love to work with you to answer all of your questions and help you figure out how to launch your show. If you're interested in working with me, fill out the intake form in the show notes. I can't wait to help you make the podcast of your dreams. The next food podcast on today's list is called That Was Delicious. This podcast is for those of us who consider food as more than just fuel. It's an art, a way to connect people, and so much more. Some episodes are interviews with people who have shaped the world of food, and other episodes are solo episodes where the host talks about food topics that are near and dear to her heart, like how to find amazing restaurants in any city and the must-buy foods at Costco. Most episodes are around an hour long. That episode about the must-buy foods at Costco was interesting to listen to and made me excited about my next trip there. So, if you're a Costco shopper, then I highly recommend listening to that episode. The last show on today's list of food podcasts is called Just Cheesy, the podcast. Yes, this podcast is all about cheese. It's a great way to get a little chuckle while learning about the delicious culinary miracle that is cheese. Each episode is only about 10 minutes long, and the way the hosts interact with each other is maybe the low-key MVP of the show. And to top it all off, each episode has a very cheesy joke. This podcast pretty much has everything. One episode that I recommend starting with is called Going for Mold. They talk about all of the different types of mold, including red mold. I didn't know that was a thing until this episode. I'll make sure to link it in the show notes. Well, I'm officially hungry now. Hopefully you found a podcast, or several, that piqued your interest and you can learn more about food in a fun way. Also, if you've been thinking about starting a podcast but you're overwhelmed by all of the aspects of starting a podcast, let's hop on a free podcast consult to talk through your concerns. Talk to you soon. I'm just now realizing that I didn't say that I was going to link all of the episodes in the show notes, but I will.